the strangest things sometimes, especially if his Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was, "Hello everyone, welcome to Fantasy Corner. I know you've come here to relax and fall asleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now, get comfortable, let your worries fade, and let's begin. Story number 1. Just as I thought those things scuttered off elsewhere, they came crawling right back and let their presence be known to me. I think they knew I'm inside. I fear that stepping out that door would surge a sharp feeling of dread, so much so I may struggle to breath, or my head hurts, and I felt like this since their horrid singing started echoing through the trees again. You're lucky to even be reading such right now. If it weren't for my immediate family expressing that they believe me, that I am not a madman, I dare not share this story on the internet in fear no soul would listen. It was a cold day in January, but it was set to be a good day, for it was my last in the workplace, and I was set to fly up to Vancouver later that night. Most of my relatives live near the city, and they wanted to throw a celebration. Who would I be not to accept? And so the day prior, I had already made all the preparations for the trip. The struggle that day was on the drive home. I felt tired, and the monotonous task of sitting in traffic stole most of my time. The sun started to set, and the sky shone a deep red. I flicked on my vehicle's headlights. The highway was packed due to a pileup ahead. The crashes were awful, and 7 of the 8 vehicles seemed damaged beyond repair. White tarps covered a large chunk of the road, and red was splattered upon one of the windshields. It wasn't a very welcoming scene, to say the least. It's the worst crash I've ever seen in person. I was just ecstatic to finally move past. The moon shone bright behind the towering trees. I live in a really wooded area, so at some point during the drive, everything became quiet and tranquil. I was on the last stretch of road before reaching my street, and nothing but darkness flooded the view ahead. I closed my eyes, and for a second, swerved into the other lane. A curdling screech echoed into the forest, and marks stained the concrete. I lost complete control of the vehicle. Coming towards the top of my street, my car wrapped around a tree. I was bleeding a bit, and smoke rose from beneath the car's hood. It was quiet, and an awful pain surged through my right hand. For a second, I assumed it to be broken, as when I woke, all was cold, and I couldn't feel a thing. Even the forest emanated a terrible, eerie stiffness. The grotesque silhouettes of trees watched as I slithered out the passenger side window. Such was hardly noticeable under the moonlight, yet in that moment I noticed the scent of gasoline, the bumps in the concrete, the faint sparkles of melting snow, the individual shards of glass, and the flakes of steel upon the ground. I couldn't fathom how intricate the world was at that moment. I started pacing towards my house as it was just down the street. A weight felt to be holding me down. I passed one house, then a section of thick woods, then another house. As I dragged myself along, I reached into my pockets and found my phone, to which I would then call the police. "What's your emergency?" I crashed my car atop my street, Blake Avenue. Thank God I'm not too hurt. I'm walking back home right now. "It's not blocking the road, is it? And you're able to walk home?" "It's crashed into a tree," I replied. "It shouldn't be blocking anything. And yes, I should make it back home." "Okay, where do you live?" "Somebody's on their way over now." "Blake Avenue." "It's the last house on the street." Before the operator could reply, the phone slipped from my hands, and I fell upon the concrete. Something grabbed my ankle. It slithered into the forest, dragging me along its path. Earth seeped through my teeth. Under the moonlight, the creature didn't miss a step, and its grip grew tighter and tighter. I drew blood upon the cold foliage, and my clothing developed awful tears. Attempting to yell out for help, only silence answered. The being, for what I could tell, was fairly small in height, but its strength was immense, and its dry skin was warm against my own. Through the blur of the forest, I saw its faint, pale silhouette, and its voided eyes. A soul neigh rested behind them. Not before long it trekked across a loud, rushing stream. For a moment I was submerged underwater. My foot became numb. As I peered through the branches into stars, struggling against such horrid force, my head bashed against a large stone and all fell to black. A consciousness still briefly streamed through the mind. I thought to have crossed to a higher plane and stood against nothing, and sat until I saw light once again. I woke in a dimly lit den, and my hands were tied against a large frame. A low hum echoed through the brutal walls. In the corner, a single candle was lit, its light fading into the rest of the chamber, and below, various articles scattered along the dirt floor. It smelled of sweat. Scratch marks trailed up the walls, topped by very small windows, and the moonlight barely seeped through. I was underground, it seemed, just below the surface, everything twisted, and I started to shake the frame. Screams echoed throughout the den, with only some sourcing from myself. The knots wouldn't budge, and blood seeped from my wrists, trailing down my arm. Nothing seemed to be enough. I kept hearing unimaginable sounds from every corner, yet caught no sight of their source. Eventually, I stopped the struggle. By the time the sun woke, the candle flickered for a final time. I watched as the rays journeyed from one end of the den to the other, highlighting suspended dust. I thought of how many breaths I had left until death spoke to me. As the day passed, that grew to be the most favorable outcome. The night fell, and in the darkness ahead, I saw movement. I hadn't known exactly what it was within the shadows until a match was struck, and the candle was lit shortly after. Its fingers were disturbingly long, and it looked straight into me and its face. With every turn of its head, its accursed features became abundantly more clear. It tread closer, and so I refused to move, let alone blink. Sounds gurgled through the being's teeth. It stopped, and I could feel its breath with its head at a tilt. It looked into my eyes, dim within the candlelight. The being screeched and began to circle around the room, rustling through the garbage on the floor. It was animalistic in movement, stepping upon all fours. I yelled yet again to no avail. Another creature entered the chamber, then another, and another. All appeared similar to the first. Some held torches, and the chamber illuminated in warm orange. They danced in many circles, singing terrible songs. The screeches were deafening, and they rustled the post to which I was tied. Then the madness suddenly stopped, and all returned to quiet. They turned towards me. One pushed all others to the side and stepped in front, its breath warm against my skin. It eyed me up and down and took hold of my wrist, and with a hearty snap tore off my ring finger. The crowd erupted, and along with my hand, my ears started to bleed. Dreadful passion echoed through their voices, and pain surged through my own. I yelled, "Stop! What'd I do to deserve such a thing?" They let out laughs and many songs and continued to dance around the room. And once the sun started to rise, they trickled slowly out of the chamber, and the candlelight burned out once again. My breath was heavy, but hope soon awaited me. For once much of the day passed, I heard another human's voice from afar. "Hello, Richard. Yell out if you hear me." "Yes," I yelled. "I'm down here in the den. There are creatures that have kept me." "Oh, thank goodness you're alive. It's your friend, Derry. Keep talking to me." "I'm starving, Derry. You have no idea how lovely it is to hear your voice." Derry took a few steps down to an underpass, following my voice. He passed many chambers which were separate to mine and stepped over piles of cloth and rubbish. And then I saw him. It felt incredible to see another person again, let alone a childhood friend. He was holding a flashlight, and he marched forward and reached for a pocket knife. With it, he cut me down, and I rested on his chest for a minute or two. A tear or two shed from my eyes. "Sigh," I said. "It's been over a day, and seeing you brings joy to my heart." "You're okay," he said, "but let's get out of here. A search was put on your name after the crash, you know, and even your family reached out in concern." He led me out of the chamber. The den was bigger than I had originally thought. Many hallways connected to create a large underground tunnel system. The place was nasty. Bones stuck out of the dirt floor, and the stench only worsened as Derry led the way forward. I was definitely not their first victim. They had been doing such for a long while. Derry looked towards me. "What happened to your hand?" "They cut off my finger, and they danced around with it. I swear to you." Derry seemed confused. "What? Who are they? And what the hell is this place?" Derry, if I had an answer, I would have told you by now. I passed out, and when I awoke, I was already tied up. Derry led to the entrance, or rather exit, of the den, and the moonlight shone through the fog of the trees, and a huge weight was lifted from within. I was finally out of that god-awful place. So we moved on, with Derry leading the way. The snow was no longer, and it finally melted away. For a change, the ambience was actually comforting, and it was a relief to breathe some fresh air. Derry led to a fairly unkempt trail and continued on about how he'd been hiking for hours while screaming my name. Other people were also out that night looking for me, but unfortunately most people who go missing in my town are never found. And I think only I know the answer as to why. The path eventually crosses with a pond and continues on the other side of a small wooden bridge. Stars reflected upon the still, muddy water, and the rustling of foliage was heard distantly. Owls made their presence known with their eerie calls. "So who did it?" Derry asked. "What did the guy look like?" "You'd not believe me if I told you, but it was not human." And then Derry fell to the ground, and screeches sourced from behind. There were about 15 or 20 of them. He yelled out my name and told me to run as fast as possible. I watched as the beams dragged him away. With a thick crack, they snapped off his hand, and Derry was dragged into the heart of the woods. And I ran as fast as I possibly could. Twigs snapped below my feet, and I could feel them behind me. I ended up cutting through a neighbor's backyard and made it to the street. Blake Avenue was no longer quiet. I could hear them cackling in the woods, running alongside within the shadows, and I ran till my knees started to give in. Everything was a blur. But I soon saw my home in the distance, and all started to hurt, and my mind began to spin. I refused to believe that I would make it, and I would end up with Derry exactly how I was before. One straggled right behind me. It tugged on my clothing. Surely I was dead, but I soon reached my doorstep and twisted the key. Their screams continued in the forest outside, and I finally made it back home. I contacted the police a day later, and they found the remains of 4 people. 2 of them were missing children, and 1 was Derry. The last was another man who once lived on my street. Authorities claimed the attacks were from wolves, or possibly a bear, and refused to believe anything I tell them. All the doors in my house still remain locked. I have no idea what to do, for I have not been outside in weeks, and I refuse to step a single foot out there. And they haunt me at night. They screech and laugh at my doorstep, and I cry before falling asleep. I thought they were gone for a while too. It's been weeks, I tell you, weeks. Perhaps I have gone a little mad, but does that even matter? And my hand really hurts. It's not healing well, but I don't care about anything else right now. I want those things dead, and I want to see my family. They're the only ones who even believe me. And in reflection, retiring has been the worst decision I've ever made. Story number 2. I've been hunting all my life, and I have yet to see anything else like what I saw. To this day, I still don't have a definite answer for it. Maybe some of y'all will know. I was 19 at the time. I'd just gotten off of work, so I figured I might as well go hunting. I got my rifle and hopped in my truck, and away I went. I got there about 3.5 hours before dark, plenty of time to get to my stand. I crossed the creek and started up the hill, and I saw something move fairly fast through the trees. I figured it must have just been a deer. Already spooked one, not good. Got to my stand and climbed up it, text my dad to tell him I got there safe. I loaded my rifle and got comfortable and waited. Well, about an hour later, a herd of does I'd seen on my camera showed up. They milled around for about 30 minutes before they left to go eat some acorns behind me. I saw a 4-point about 10 minutes later, not what I was after. About 30 minutes later, I hear something making racket about 200 yards in front of me in a tree line across the field. I had an iron-sighted gun, so I wasn't willing to shoot the 200 yards. The gun I had was a .444 Marlin lever action. I'd hunted with it since I was 12 and had taken countless deer with it. It's a bit overkill for deer, but I liked the stopping power. Eventually a deer walked out, looked like a pretty good buck. As he got closer, about 150 yards, I noticed something was off with him. Maybe it was that CW disease or whatever it's called, I thought. It started making these unholy sounds and started to get up on its hind legs. I'd heard stories from old-timers about things that go thump in the woods, but never believed them. I decided I was probably just tired from work. He stayed in the field, still acting weird, until it was just about time for me to get down and head back to the truck. I started to get down and was about 10 feet off the ground, and I heard a blood-curdling scream from the field. It scared the daylights out of me, and I slipped and fell off the ladder. When I got up, I looked back, and it was on its hind legs in a dead sprint towards me. I took off running and jumped in the creek and laid down on the bank. I peeked over the side, and it was up there, walking and looking for presumably me. He saw me, so I raised my rifle and fired. The shot rang out, and I heard it hit him. I racked another round in, but he was on the ground. I was relieved and my mind was spinning. Before I could think of my next move, he was back on his legs and started walking towards me. It rained so fast I thought I was going to fall. He was about 15 yards behind me, but he was closing in. I turned around and fired another shot with hopes that it would stun him. It didn't. I counted my options and decided on a risky plan. I ran to a secondary path out, one which had a creek that was flooded from rain the night before. I swam across it, but he couldn't swim, and he didn't want to seem to get anywhere near water. He let out another blood-curdling scream, so I shot him again. This time he seemed like it hurt him. I had one bullet left after that. I got to my truck, and of course it wouldn't start. That's what I get for driving a diesel in late November. I finally got it to turn over and started to back up when I saw him running at me, faster than he previously was. I stuck my rifle out the window of my truck and waited until he got close. He was about 10 feet in front of me when I fired. I could see him well when he was that close. He was a 10-point. His head had no bottom jaw or eyes, and his hide was peeling away. His entire body looked withered. When I shot, he hit the dirt, hard. I hightailed it home and told my dad what had happened. He didn't believe me. I went back the next day to see if there was any proof. He was gone. All the tracks were gone. There was nothing that even indicated that even happened besides my spent casings on the ground. If anyone has any idea about what that thing was, please let me know. I'm writing this while I'm in the deer stand, so hopefully it's not bad luck, although I do hear a strange sound in the trees across from me. Story number 3. My parents are immigrants from Mexico, so growing up, we didn't receive Christmas presents. The few times we did receive anything, my parents would take us to the store and told us to choose one present. After we chose our present, we would get back home, wrap it up, and put it under the Christmas tree. Although we grew up without much, it was enough to make me and my siblings grateful and happy. Say during Christmas when I was in 4th grade. Imagine my surprise when we woke up the next morning to find more than one gift for each of us. That memory of all the presents around the Christmas tree is forever ingrained into my mind. There was a big box with my name on it, so I grabbed it and ripped up the wrapping paper. It was a Bratz Chloe doll that was about 2 feet tall. I was extremely happy and grateful to my parents that I remembered I cried. Later on I found out that my cousin, who I see as a sister, got the same doll. So we played with each other many times, brushing their hair, doing fashion shows and all that stuff. Here is when things took a turn that Christmas. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. My parents, me, and my 3 siblings all shared that one room. But a few months later, we moved to another apartment with 2 bedrooms, which is where this takes place. I was sitting in the living room watching TV since I was on the edge of the couch. Out of the corner of my eye, I can see the hallway that leads straight into the bedroom when the door is open. It's me and my 3 siblings. So we had bunk beds and the 4 of us shared the room. We're 2 boys and 2 girls, all in elementary school. I can see my little brother playing with his cars, and after a while, I see him running down the hall street to me and he says, "Little bruh, why is your doll on the floor?" "What do you mean?" "She's on the nightstand where I put her." "No, she's on the floor, mate." A little annoyed, "Did you drop her, little brother?" So I remember getting up, going down the hall, and as soon as I pass the door, I can see her face down on the carpet, a few feet away from the nightstand where I put her. The nightstand was right by the door, so as soon as you walk into the room, the nightstand is to your right. My other dolls were there exactly where I had put them, so I found it odd that if she were to fall down, how come the other dolls didn't fall as well? I stood there, and for some reason I remember I felt scared, which has never happened before with my other dolls. So I slowly walked toward her, grabbed her and flipped her over and placed her back in her spot right in the middle of the nightstand, leaning against the wall. One thing I clearly remember about this doll is that her eyes are not facing straight forward. They're looking to the right side. So when I finished placing her and looked at her for a little bit, I was going to walk right by her to leave the room when out of the corner of my eye, I could swear that I saw her eyes move from left to right. I remember how startled I felt when I saw that I backed up and just looked at her. After a few seconds, I just ran across the hall and sat back down in the living room. Since I had my dolls set up on the nightstand right by the door, I had clear vision of her from my bed, so I couldn't fall asleep. I was really young, but I remember how uncomfortable I felt. I don't remember how many days passed, but I got tired of her and put her in a plastic trash bag and stuffed her at the very top of the pantry. The wall of the pantry was the same wall that the sofa was up against. One night my dad called ahead of time, said that he was going to come home late. For some reason I remember I couldn't sleep. So I told my mom that I will wait for my dad to come back, and I slept in the living room. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling pressure on my chest, and this intense feeling of fear and dread overcame me that I started crying. My ears started ringing, and that's when I started hearing kicking or knocking noises coming behind me from the pantry. As I was laying on my side, I rolled over to the edge of the sofa, and I could see my dad laying there, and I remember feeling relieved but still scared. So I held his hand and closed my eyes, and I managed to fall asleep. Ever since then, I would barely eat, and during random moments of the day, I would feel that pain in my chest and get overcome with fear and would just start crying. I don't know how long this happened for, but I got so tired of feeling this way that I told my mom what was happening. "Mom, something's happening to me. I was meaning to ask you, I noticed you were eating less, but since you were sick, I thought that's what it was, but you're not sick anymore, so what's going on? Are you?" Then I proceeded to tell her everything that I just mentioned, and to be honest, it sounded ridiculous as it was coming out of my mouth. My mom said, "Don't worry, it's just a doll." So she went to the pantry, opened the door, and saw that the doll was at the very top shelf in a plastic trash bag. She grabbed it and then went into her room and placed it at the very top shelf in her closet. "There, you don't need to worry about it anymore, okay? It's just a doll." Many of you may say that my mom should have paid more attention to the situation at hand. But honestly, I don't blame her. I don't know what I would do if my child were to come to me and say that their doll was kicking the wall in the middle of the night. More time passed, and I remembered I started going to school again since winter break was over. I will still feel the same pressure in my chest, followed by the same feeling of immense dread and fear. But I wouldn't cry since I was at school. So I just sit in place and tried to relax until the feeling stopped. I became scared of being in my home. I started looking forward to going to school. I tried to do activities after school. I looked forward to going to relatives' houses and possibly staying the night. I looked forward to going to church and Bible study. I tried to avoid being home as much as possible. Then something unexpected happened. My older brother came to me and asked, "Did you see your doll move?" I remember I froze and couldn't believe what he was saying. I told him no, I don't think so, but then I proceeded to tell him everything that was happening. My brother has always been serious, which takes people aback just how serious he is. So him telling me this surprised me. Keep in mind that we're still just kids. I was in 4th grade, which means that he was in 5th grade. After I finished telling him what happened, he then told me that he had a nightmare. Your doll was walking down the hallway. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but she was talking to me. But I felt scared. This really surprised me, and I felt bad that they may be experiencing what I've been feeling these past few weeks. So I wondered if my 2 younger siblings were experiencing something similar. I asked my little brother, who would have been in 2nd grade at the time, and he said that the night when he saw my doll on the floor is when he started feeling scared of her. Our youngest sibling, my little sister, was really young and she didn't know what we were talking about. Then, one day we went to my aunt's house. This is the same aunt that today we do not keep in contact with because various instances such as this one confirmed that she tried to harm us and my close family. Yes, she is a witch, for some reason, which we know now. She was able to see that something was off about me. I had just finished tearing up because I felt the familiar feeling of fear and dread. So that's when my mom told her what was happening with the doll. She told my mom that it's important to listen to what the kids are saying. So that is one thing I feel grateful to her for. After we left her house, we came back home, and we were sitting down in the living room. Then my dad brought the doll from the closet, and they started talking to me and asking questions. At the end of everything, my dad decided to go throw the doll to the dumpster, and I feel bad knowing that it was probably expensive. So a few days passed, and my mom took us to the pool. Without me knowing, my parents brought a healer or shaman to the house to do a cleanup process. Now that I'm older, my parents told me what happened. They say that the healer said that there was a demon inside of my doll. My parents were very puzzled then. They asked her, how could that possibly happen? The healer told them that they feed off the innocent, their fear and pain. I don't know if I should make this connection, but this is what has been bothering me. I tend to pass out at least once or twice a year ever since I was 13. I'm 21 now. I've been to doctors and cardiologists, and none of them seem to know why I pass out. The very first time I passed out was when I was 13, and it was at church. We were on our knees, and I remember feeling this gust of wind hitting my face before I passed out. When I passed out, I remember seeing white fog and someone screaming in a distance. As the fog started to disappear, and I could see in front of me, I remember seeing this wrecked red car that looked like the aftermath of a violent car crash and someone inside screaming for help. That is when I woke up and my dad was holding me. Later on, my siblings were telling me that I was the one screaming. This has resulted in me having a fear of driving. I shake a lot and I get anxious. It has more of an impact on me because this happened at church. I can't help but think of this as a sign to never drive a red car, or if my final moments on this earth would be me in a car crash screaming for help. This has impacted my life in more ways than one. The times I've passed out and hurt myself is when my dad wasn't there to catch me. This has caused my parents to worry and why I decided to go to a local college. But now I can't seem to think that maybe in some ways these life experiences are connected. Keep in mind that my parents are superstitious, and in Mexican culture there are a lot of superstitions. I went to Mexico for a summer with my older brother, and we heard a lot of stories about urban legends and superstitions. Now that I'm older, my parents are opening up about instances that happened before I was born. In Mexican culture, there is this superstition that witches go around looking for unbaptized babies to take. This is why next to a baby's crib, there will be a mirror and a broom. The mirror helps because apparently witches can't stand looking at their reflection and die of embarrassment. So when my parents first had my older brother, my mom said that at night a witch would taunt them, especially my dad. She would rattle the blinds and disturb my dad's sleep and laugh at him. My dad would hardly get any sleep, which isn't good since he would wake up really early and came back home really late. He worked very long hours, so he needed sleep. My mom said it came to a point where my dad wasn't afraid anymore, and he got angry instead. So when the witch came again to disturb them, he took out a knife from under his pillow, stood up and confronted the witch and cursed at her and told her to leave him and his family alone. Later on, they found out that it was that aunt who sent the witch to torment my dad. That aunt so far has caused one divorce, illness, and family drama that resulted in conflict, and it has caused my uncle, her husband who is related to us, to be estranged from the rest of the family. She apparently put a spell on my uncle to never leave her, which is why, although she has made the family's life hell, he still remains by her side. Story number 4. I've worked in Grandpa's shop for most of my life. It's been the first job for not just me, but all my siblings and most of my cousins. Grandpa runs a little pawn shop downtown, the kind of place that sells antiques as well as modern stuff, and he does pretty well. I don't think I've ever seen him worry about paying rent, and he can afford to pay us kids better than any other place in the neighborhood. All the other kids quit on it after a while, but I enjoyed the work and Grandpa always said I had a real knack for it. You keep at it, kid, and someday this old shop will be yours. Grandpa and I live above the shop. He offered me the spare room after Grandma died a few years back, and it's been a pretty good arrangement. Every evening, he turns on the radio and cracks a beer and we sit around and drink and he tells stories from back in the day. But the radio never seemed to make any noise, and I asked him why he kept it around. He told me it was something he'd had for a long time, and it was special. I asked how the old radio was special, and he said that was a long story if I had time for it. I said I didn't have anything else to do but sit here and listen to the rain, and Grandpa settled in as the old thing clicked and clinked in the background. Grandpa grew up in the early 60s. Technically, he grew up in the 40s and 50s, but in a lot of his stories, it doesn't really seem like his life began until 1962. He describes it as one of the most interesting times of his life, and a lot of it is because of his father. My great-grandpa, he grew up in Chicago, and the town was just starting to get its feet under it after years of war and strife. His mother had died when he was 14, and his father opened a pawn shop with the money he'd gotten from her life insurance policy. They weren't called pawn shops at that point. I think Grandpa said what my great-grandfather had was a brokerage or something. But all that mattered was that people came in and tried to sell him strange and wondrous things sometimes. Great-grandpa had run the place with his family, which consisted of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-uncle Terry. Great-great-grandma lived with them, but she didn't help out around the shop much. She had dementia, so she mostly stayed upstairs in her room as she kidded and waited to die. They lived above the shop in a little 3-bedroom flat. It was a little tight, Grandpa said, but they did all right. Grandpa worked at the pawn shop since he needed money to pay for his own apartment, and he said they got some of the strangest things sometimes, especially if his Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was an odd duck, and that's coming from a family that wasn't strictly normal. Dad would usually buy things that he knew he could sell easily: appliances, tools, cars, furniture, that sort of thing. Uncle Terry, however, would often buy things that were a little less easy to move. He bought a bunch of old movie props once from a guy who claimed they were genuine props from an old Bela Lugosi film, and Dad lost his shirt on them. Uncle Terry was also the one who bought the jewelry that turned out to be stolen, but that was okay because they turned it into the police, and the reward was worth way more than they had spent on it. Terry was like a metronome. He'd make the worst choices and then the best choices, and sometimes they were the same choices all at once. So, of course, Terry had been the one to buy the radio. Dad had been sick for about a week, and it had been bad enough that the family had worried he might not come back from it. People in those times didn't always get over illnesses, and unless you had money to go see a doctor, you either got better or you didn't. He had finally hacked it all up and got better, and was ready to return to work. So he comes downstairs to the floor where Terry is sitting there reading some kind of artsy-fartsy magazine, and he looks over and sees that they've taken in a new radio, this big old German model with dark wood cabinet and dials that looked out of a Frankenstein's lab. He thinks it looks pretty good, and he congratulates Terry, telling him everybody wants a good radio, and that'll be real easy to sell. Terry looks up over his magazine and tells him it ain't a radio. Dad asks him just what the hell it is then, and Terry lays down his magazine and gives him the biggest, creepiest grin you've ever seen. It's a spirit radio. Terry announces that's supposed to mean something. I was working when Dad and Uncle Terry had that conversation, and Dad just pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head, like he was trying not to bash Terry's skull in after buying a bunch of counterfeit movie posters, the kind that Dad didn't need an expert to tell him were fake. Uncle Terry had been put on a strict $100 a month budget of things he could buy for the shop, so anything over $100 he had to go talk to Dad about. And since Dad hadn't had any visits from Uncle Terry, other than to bring him food in the last week, Dad knew that it either had cost less than $100 or Uncle Terry hadn't asked, "How much did this thing cost, Terry?" Dad asked, clearly expecting to be angry. Terry seemed to hedge a little. "It's nothing, Brian. The thing will pay for itself by the end of the month. You'll see. I'll show you the thing really is." "How much?" my dad asked, making it sound like a threat. Spacetti was kind 500. "But, Brian, I've already made back 200 of that. Give me another week and I'll," but Dad had heard enough. "You spent $500 on this thing. It better be gold-plated, because $500 is a lot of money for a damn radio." Terry tried to explain, but Dad wasn't having any of it. He told Terry to get out of the shop for a while. Otherwise, he was probably going to commit fratricide, and Terry suddenly remembered a friend he had to see and made himself scarce. Then Dad rounds on me like had something to do with it, and asks how much Terry had really spent on the thing. I told him he had actually spent about $550 on it, and Dad asked why in heaven's name no one had consulted him before spending such an astronomical sum. The truth of the matter was, I was a little spooked by the radio. The guy had brought it in on a rainy afternoon, the dolly covered by an old blanket, and when he wheeled it up to the counter, I had come to see what he had brought. Terry was already there, reading and doing a lot of nothing, and he had perked up when the old guy told him he had something miraculous to show him. I didn't much care for the old guy, myself. He sounded foreign, East or West German, and his glass eye wasn't fooling anyone. He whipped the quilt off the cabinet like a showman doing a trick, and there was the spirit radio humming placidly before the front desk. Uncle Terry asked him what it was, and the man said he would be happy to demonstrate. He took out a pocket knife and cut his finger, sprinkling the blood into a bowl of crystals on top of it. As the blood fell on the rocks, the dials began to glow and the thing hummed to life. Uncle Terry had started to tell the man that he didn't have to do that, but as it glowed and crooned, his protests died on his lips. "Spirit radio," the man said. "Who will win tomorrow's baseball game?" "The Phillies," the box intoned in a deep and unsettling voice. "Will defeat the Cubs, 9-7. Uncle Terry looked ready to buy it on the spot, but when he asked what the man wanted for it, he balked a little at the price. They dickered, going back and forth for nearly a half hour until they finally settled on $550. I could see Dad getting mad again, so I told him the rest of it too. Terry isn't wrong either. He's been using that spirit radio thing to bet on different stuff. The Phillies actually did win their game the next day, 9-7, and he's been making bets and collecting debts ever since. He's paid the store back $200, but I know he's won more than that. Dad still looked mad, but he looked intrigued too. Dad didn't put a lot of stock in weirdness, but he understood money. I saw him look at the spirit radio, look at the bowl of crystals on top of it, and when he dug out his old buck knife, I turned away before I could watch him slice himself. He grunted and squeezed a few drops over the bowl, and when the radio purred to life, I turned back to see it glowing. It had an eerie blue glow, the dials softly emitting light through the foggy glass, and it always made me shiver when I watched it. To this day, I think those were spirits, ghosts of those who had used it, but who knows? I'd hesitated, maybe sensing what I had sensed too. And when he spoke, his voice quavered for the first time I could remember. "Who will win the first race at the dog track tomorrow?" he asked. First, the radio softly hummed and contemplated, and finally whispered, "Mama's boy will win the first race of the day at Olsen Park track tomorrow." Dad rubbed his face, and I could hear the scrub of stubble on his palm. He thought about it, resting a hand on the box, and went to the register to see what we had made while he was gone. When Uncle Terry came back, Dad handed him an envelope and told him to shut up when he tried to explain himself. "You'll be at the Olsen Park track tomorrow for the first race. You will take the money in the envelope. You will bet every cent of it on Mama's boy to win in the first race, and you will bring me all the winnings back. If you lose that money, I will put this thing in the window. I will sell it as a regular radio, and you will never be allowed to purchase anything for the shop again." "And if he wins?" Terry had asked, but Dad didn't answer. Grandpa took a sip of his beer then and got a faraway look as he contemplated. That was just how Grandpa told stories. He always looked like he was living in the times when he was talking about, and I suppose in a lot of ways he was going back to the 1960s, the most interesting time of his young life, to a time when he encountered something he couldn't quite explain. "So did he win?" I asked, invested now as we sat in the apartment above the shop, drinking beer and watching it rain. "Oh, yes," Grandpa said. "He won. And when Uncle Terry came back with the money, I think Dad was as surprised as Terry was. Terry had been using it, but it always felt like he was operating under the idea that it was some kind of monkey's paw situation, and that after a while there would be an accounting for what he had won. When a month went by, however, and there was no downside to using the radio, Terry got a little more comfortable. He started to ask it other things, the results of boxing matches, horse races, sporting events, and anything else he could use to make money. It got so bad that his fingers started to look like pin cushions, and he started cutting into his palms and arms. It seemed like more blood equaled better results, and sometimes he could get a play-by-play if he bled more for it. Dad would use it sparingly, still not liking to give it his blood, but Uncle Terry was adamant about it. And even though it hurt him, he used it a lot. He could always be seen hanging around that radio, talking to it and feeding it. Dad didn't like the method, but he liked the money it brought in. The shop was doing better than ever, thanks to the cash injection from the spirit radio, and Dad was buying better things to stock it with. He bought some cars, some luxury electronics, and always at a net gain to the store once they sold. Times were good, everyone was doing well, but that's when Uncle Terry took it too far. First he brought the bottle to his mouth, but it didn't quite make it. It seemed to get stuck halfway there, the contents spilling on his undershirt as he watched the rain. He jumped when the cold liquid touched him and righted it, putting it down before laughing at himself. He shook the drops off his shirt and looked back at the rain, running his tongue over his dry lips. My night. We tied on a few too many, and my uncle got this really serious look on his face. He staggered downstairs despite Dad yelling at him and asking where he was going. When he started yelling, we ran downstairs to see what was going on. He was leaning over to the spirit radio, with the tip of his finger dribbling as he yelled at it. He held it out, letting the blood fall onto the crystal dish on top of the radio, and as it came to life, he put his ruddy face very close to the wooden cabinet and blistered out his question, clearly not for the first time. "When will I die?" The radio was silent, the lights blinking, but it didn't return an answer. He cut another finger, asking the same question, but it still never returned an answer. Before we could stop him, he had split his palm almost to the wrist, and as the blood dripped onto the stones, he nearly screamed his question at it. "When will I die?" The spirit radio still said nothing, and Dad and I had to restrain him before he could do it again. We don't know what brought this on. We never found out, but Uncle Terry became very interested in death, and more specifically when he was going to die. I don't know, maybe all the spirit talk got him thinking. Maybe he was afraid that one day his voice was going to come out of that radio. Whatever the case, Dad put a stop to using it. He hid the thing, and he had to keep moving it because Uncle Terry always found it again. He would hide it for a day or two, but eventually we would find him, bleeding from his palms and pressing his face against it. Sometimes I could hear him whispering to it like it was talking back to him. I didn't like those times. It was creepy, but Uncle Terry was attached at the hip to this damn radio. It went on for about a month until Uncle Terry did something unforgivable and got his answer. He watched the rain for a moment longer, his teeth chattering a little as if he were trying to get the sound out of his head. Grandpa didn't much care for the rain. I had known him to close the shop if it got really bad, and it always seemed to make him extremely uncomfortable. That's why we were sitting up here in the first place, and I believe that Grandpa would have liked to be drinking something a little stronger. Dad and I got a call about something big, something he really wanted. It was an old armoire, an antique from the Civil War era, and the guy selling it, at least according to Dad, was asking way less than it was worth. He wanted me to come along to help move it, and said he didn't feel like Terry would be of any use in this. He's been flaky lately, obsessed with that damn radio, won't even leave the house. To say that Terry had been flaky was an understatement. Uncle Terry had been downright weird. He never left the shop, just kept looking for the radio, and I started to notice a weird smell sometimes around the house. I suspected that he wasn't bathing, and I never saw him eat or sleep. He just hunted for the radio and fed it his blood when he found it. Dad had already asked him, and Terry said he was busy. So Dad had told him to keep an eye on Mother. My great-great-great-grandmother had been suffering from dementia for years, and Dad and Uncle Terry had decided to keep an eye on her instead of just putting her in a home. Terry had agreed, and as we left the house, the rain had started to come down. That's what I'll always remember about that day. The way the rain came down in buckets, like the sky was crying for what was about to happen. We got the armoire onto the trailer. The guy had a thick old quilt that we put over it to stop it from getting wet. And when we got back to the shop, we brought it in and left it in the back room. Dad was smiling. He knew he had something special here and was excited to see what he could get for it. We both squished as we went upstairs to get fresh clothes on, joking about the trip until we got to the landing. Dad put out a hand, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed. I could smell it too, though I couldn't identify it at the time. Dad must have recognized it because he burst into the apartment like a cop looking for dope. Uncle Terry was sitting in the living room, his hands red and his knees getting redder by the minute. He was rocking back and forth, the spirit radio glowing beside him as he repeated the same thing again and again. He had found it wherever Dad had hidden it and had clearly been up to his old tricks again. Dad stood over him as he rocked, his fists tightening like he wanted to hit him, and when he growled at him, I took a step away, sensing the rage that was building there. "What have you done?" he asked. "Today. It's today. It's today." Terry kept right on repeating, rocking back and forth as he sobbed to himself. Dad turned to the bowl on top of the spirit radio, and he must have not liked what he saw. I saw it later, after everything that came next, and it was full of blood. The crystals were swimming in it, practically floating in the thick red blood, and Dad seemed to be doing the math. There was more blood than a finger prick or a palm cut, and Dad was clearly getting worried, given that Uncle Terry was still conscious. "Where's Mom?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Today, it's today. It's today." "Where's our mother, Terry?" Dad yelled, leaning down to grab him by the collar and pull him up. Uncle Terry had blood on his hands up to the elbows, but instead of dripping off onto the floor, it stayed caked on him in thick, dry patches. The shaking seemed to have brought him out of his haze. "It said if I wanted the answer, I had to sacrifice," Terry said, his voice cracking. "It said I had to give up something important if I wanted to know something so important. Something I loved. The others weren't enough. I didn't even know them, but mother was... But he stopped stammering when Dad wrapped his hands around his throat. He choked him, shaking him violently as he screamed wordlessly into his dying face. And when he dropped him, Uncle Terry didn't move. Dad and I just stood there for a second, Dad seeming to remember that I was there at all. And when he caught sight of the softly glowing radio, the subject of my uncle's obsession, he pivoted and lifted his foot to kick the thing. I could tell he meant to destroy it, to not stop kicking until it was splinters on the floor. But something stopped him. Whether it was regret for what he had done or some otherworldly force, my dad found himself unable to strike the cabinet. Maybe he was afraid of letting his spirits out. I would never know. Instead, he went to call the police so they could come and collect the bodies. They might also collect him. But we didn't talk about that as we sat in silence until they arrived. Dad told the police that my uncle had admitted to killing their mother, and he had killed in the blind rage. They went to the back bedroom and confirmed that my grandmother was dead. Dad didn't tell me until he lay dying of cancer years later, but Terry had cut her heart out and offered it to the bowl on top of the radio. We assumed he did, at least, because we never found any evidence of it in the house or the bowl. It was never discovered, and the police believed he had ground it up. They also discovered the bodies of 3 homeless men rotting in the back of Terry's closet. He had bled them, something that had stained the wood in that room so badly that we had to replace it. How he had done all of this without anyone noticing, we had no idea. He had to have been luring them in while we were out doing other things. And if it hadn't been for my grandmother's death being directly linked to him, I truly believe Dad would have been as much of a suspect as Uncle Terry. They took the bodies away. They took the bowl away, though they returned it later, and I ended up moving in with Dad. He got kind of depressed after the whole thing, and helped to have someone here with him. I've lived here ever since, eventually taking over the business, and you pretty much know the rest. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the rain come down and the static from the old radio as it crackled amicably. "Have you ever used the radio?" I asked, a little afraid of the answer. Grandpa shook his head. I saw what it did to Uncle Terry, and, to a lesser degree, what it did to Dad. "I've run this shop since his death, and I did it without the radio. Then why keep it?" I asked, looking at the old thing a little differently now. "Because like Dad, I can't bring myself to destroy it, and I won't sell it to someone else so it can ruin their life too. When the shop is yours, it'll be your burden, and the choice of what to do will be up to you." I couldn't help but watch the radio, seeing it differently than I had earlier. As we sat drinking, I thought I could hear something under the sound of rain. It sounded like a low, melancholy moan that came sliding from the speakers like a whispered scream. Besides my great-uncle's voice in there somewhere. I supposed one day I might find out. Story number 5. I never thought I'd be the one to cover the night shift, but I guess that's how life throws things at you sometimes. I've always been the day shift clerk at this quiet supermarket, a regular, dependable guy doing regular, dependable work. My routine was simple: clock in at 9 a.m., deal with a steady stream of customers, and head home by 6 p.m. Easy, predictable. But last night, that all changed. It was around 8 p.m. when I got the call from my manager, Linda. Now, Linda's been nothing but kind to me since I started here. She's a sweet woman, always understanding when someone needed time off, or when the schedule had to shift around a bit. So when she called and I heard the urgency in her voice, I didn't hesitate to listen. "Tom," her voice crackled through the phone, tense and fast, "I need you to do me a big favor tonight." I could tell something was off right away. I leaned against the kitchen counter at home, glancing at my leftover dinner. "Sure, Linda. What's going on?" It's about Jackson." Her pause felt heavy, like she was picking her words carefully. "The night shift guy. He's not answering his phone, and nobody saw him leave this morning." I frowned. Jackson. He'd been working the night shift for a few months now. Quiet guy, kept to himself, but never struck me as unreliable. Maybe he's just sleeping in, forgot to charge his phone. "I wish it were that simple," Linda sighed. "I checked the cameras, Tom. He didn't leave the store." "What do you mean he didn't leave?" "I mean," she continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "he was here at 6 a.m. when the morning shift arrived. But then nothing. He was gone. It's like he vanished." My heart skipped a beat. This was getting weird. "So you need me to cover for him tonight?" "Just this once," she assured me. "I know it's short notice, but you're the only one who's free. Please, Tom. I'll owe you big time." Something in her voice made me uneasy, but I agreed. Linda had been good to me, and I couldn't leave her in the lurch. After all, what was the worst that could happen on a quiet night shift? "I'll do it," I said finally, "but only this once." Linda let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Tom. I owe you." By 10:30 p.m. I was on my way to the supermarket, mentally preparing myself for what I assumed would be a long, boring night. The store sat on the outskirts of town, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was one of those places that never saw much action, especially at night. I figured I'd probably be alone for most of my shift. As I approached the back entrance, I noticed something strange. The employee door, which was usually locked at this time of night, was blown open. A gust of wind pushed it back and forth on its hinges, creating an eerie creaking noise. And then I saw him, Jackson. He was standing just inside the doorway, shivering like a leaf in the wind. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Terror, maybe. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and gaunt. "Jackson," I called out, more confused than concerned at that moment. "What the hell are you doing out here? The manager's been looking for you." Jackson didn't respond right away. He stumbled toward me, his steps unsteady. When he got close enough, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Tom," he rasped, barely able to form the words. Don't cover the night shift." I blinked, taken aback by the urgency in his voice. What are you talking about?" "You don't understand," he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. This place, it's not what it seems. You don't want to be here at night. Trust me. I couldn't help but feel a little irritated. Jackson had always been a bit odd, but this was too much. Come on, man, you're freaking out. Maybe you just need a few days off. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so weak. No, I'm serious. Don't stay. A 3. I looked at him, puzzled. Then he continued, but if you do stay, check the last drawer of the counter. There's something there that will help you. And for God's sake, leave at 6 a.m. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. Jackson, listen to me. I'm not going back in there, he interrupted, shaking his head violently. Not ever. Then, before I could say another word, Jackson bolted, sprinting into the darkness as if his life depended on it. I stood there for a few moments, watching Jackson disappear into the night. His behavior was bizarre, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Working nights had probably gotten to him. People don't always think straight when they're sleep deprived. Still, something about his warning gnawed at the back of my mind. When I finally entered the store, I found the day shift clerk, Sarah, getting ready to leave. She greeted me with a tired smile, but I could see the relief on her face. She was more than ready to clock out. Hey Tom, she yawned. Thanks for covering tonight. No problem, I replied, glancing around. By the way, did you see Jackson earlier? He was acting kind of strange. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Jackson? No, I didn't see him. I frowned. What do you mean? He was just outside a minute ago, freaking out about something. She shook her head, clearly confused. I didn't see anyone, and I've been here the whole time. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to shrug it off. Weird. Maybe he was hiding out somewhere. Maybe, Sarah said, unconvinced. Well, good luck tonight. It's usually dead quiet, but she hesitated, biting her lip as if she wanted to say more. But what? Nothing, she said quickly, grabbing her coat. Just don't let it get to you. See you tomorrow. And with that, she left, leaving me alone in the quiet, fluorescent-lit store. The first few minutes were uneventful. A couple of customers wandered in, buying late-night snacks or picking up a few items they had forgotten. I scanned their goods, made small talk, and settled into what I thought would be an easy shift. Around 11:30 p.m., the store fell completely silent. There were no more customers, no more cars passing by outside. Just me and the hum of the refrigerators. I began to relax, thinking maybe this night shift thing wouldn't be so bad after all. But then, as I sat behind the counter, I noticed something odd. At the far end of the store, in the dimly lit aisles, there was a figure, a customer, maybe. But they weren't moving, just standing there between two aisles like they were waiting for something. Hello? I called out, peering into the darkened aisles. No response. The figure stood perfectly still at the far end of the store, where the lighting was poor, casting long, eerie shadows between the shelves. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was hard to tell if it was a person or just my mind playing tricks on me. The store was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerators and the low buzzing of the fluorescent lights above. Hello? I called out again, louder this time. No response. The figure didn't move. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was probably just a customer lingering in the shadows, perhaps deciding on a late-night snack. I turned my attention to the security monitor, thinking I could get a better look at whoever it was. Oddly enough, the camera that had a direct view of that aisle showed nothing. Just empty aisles, shelves lined with products, but no person in sight. I frowned, glancing back up toward the aisle itself, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure had moved. It was closer now, just beyond the poorly lit section, but still standing unnaturally still. My eyes flicked back to the monitor. Still nothing. The figure wasn't there. It didn't make sense. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease settling deep in my gut. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe they were standing just in a blind spot of the camera. That had to be it. But when I looked back toward the aisle again, the figure had moved again, this time much closer. Now it stood under better lighting, but somehow, the shadows still clung to them. I couldn't make out a face, just the vague silhouette of a person. They stood there, unnervingly still, as if waiting for something. My body moved before I could stop myself. I got up from behind the counter and made my way toward the aisle. As soon as I rounded the corner and entered the aisle, nothing. No one was there. I stood still for a moment, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. The store was empty. There was no one there but me. I checked every aisle, walking through each one slowly, trying to find any trace of someone having been there, but no one was inside. Eventually I returned to the counter, telling myself that whoever it was must have left the store quietly. I checked the cameras again, all clear, no sign of any movement. And then I remembered what Jackson had told me. The drawer. I hesitated, looking at the monitor again. Midnight had just passed, and the store felt even quieter now, the silence pressing in on me. Reluctantly, I opened the last drawer behind the counter, expecting maybe some keys or supplies. Instead, my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and read the first few lines. These are the rules that you need to follow to make it through the night shift. I found out about them the hard way, so I've noted all of them here to keep the new night shift clerks safe. If you encounter a strange event, please note it down. I rolled my eyes, thinking it was some elaborate prank by Jackson or one of my other co-workers. Still, a part of me couldn't shake off how serious Jackson had been when he warned me earlier. His voice echoed in my head, along with his exhausted, terrified expression. I continued reading the list. Rule 1. Occasionally you'll see a shadowy figure at the far end of the store, just standing between two aisles. It will not move, unless you ignore it. Always nod or wave to acknowledge its presence, and it will leave you alone. I felt a sudden rush of panic, and before I could stop myself, I shouted into the empty store. Yeah, real funny, guys. Really mature. My voice echoed in the aisles, but the store remained still, as if waiting. I continued reading. Rule 2. From 2 a.m. onwards, aisle still becomes different. Products are rearranged, the air is colder, and you will start to see strange things that aren't there. Sure, I muttered, rolling my eyes again. This had to be some weird initiation prank for covering the night shift. Still, a strange uneasiness settled into my bones as I read on. Rule 3. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., only 5 customers can enter the store. After the 5th one, any further customers are not human, no matter how they appear. I count them carefully, and if a 6th enters, lock yourself in the back office and do not leave until you're sure they've gone. My eyes widened as I read that one. I forced myself to keep reading. Rule 4. No matter what happens, aisle 3 must be cleaned at exactly 2:45 a.m. every night. A spill will appear on the floor out of nowhere, and you must clean it up as soon as you see it. Ignoring it will cause the spill to spread, and soon you'll notice wet footprints appearing around the store. I chuckled nervously. This was getting ridiculous. Rule 5. If the back door is left unlocked, someone or something will enter after midnight. You won't notice them, but you will feel an unsettling chill, as if someone is standing behind you. A chill ran down my spine just as I read that line. I instinctively glanced behind me at the back door, which I'd left unlocked, thinking no one would bother coming through there. We never locked it during the day, so why bother at night? The next rule sent another wave of dread through me. Rule 6. Occasionally you might catch a glimpse of yourself walking the aisles, stocking shelves, or mopping the floors. Whatever you do, do not approach them, and do not let them see you. A sense of unease started growing in the pit of my stomach. I tried laughing it off, but the truth was, this list was starting to get to me. I continued reading, my fingers trembling. Rule 7. If you hear sobbing or cries for help from the manager's office, do not go inside. The door may be ajar. The crying will get louder the closer you get, and if you open the door, it will stop. Something else will be waiting in the silence. I threw the list back in the drawer to forget all about it, when something in the corner of my eye made me freeze. A shadow flickered across the security monitor near the back door. I had to make sure no one had come in. I hurried toward the back door, expecting to find one of my coworkers sneaking around, trying to scare me. But when I reached the door, no one was there. The air felt unnaturally cold, and a draft blew in through the still open back door. I slammed it shut, feeling a shiver crawl up my neck. I locked it. Just as I turned around, there was a faint knock on the door. A cold sweat broke out on my skin, and I slowly turned back toward the door. I opened it, expecting a colleague of mine to jump out and scare me. But there was no one there. The back alley was empty. I stepped outside, glancing around. Nothing, not a soul. I shut the door and locked it. As I got back to the counter, my heart skipped a beat. I felt a cold, icy presence behind me, so real, I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, nothing but the wall. The chill lingered, creeping up my spine as I stood there, breathing heavily. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. I could feel something watching me. I had to get a grip on myself, shake off the lingering dread that clung to my skin. Standing still behind the counter wasn't helping. The rules were unsettling, sure, but that's all they were, words on paper. I needed to move around, clear my head, and remind myself that this was just a quiet, empty store. I decided to do a quick walk through the aisles, maybe even restock a few items to keep myself busy. The familiar routine would ground me, keep me from spiraling further into paranoia. As I walked along the aisles, everything seemed normal at first, the familiar rows of snacks, canned goods, and drinks stacked neatly in their places. But as I made my way toward the freezers at the back of the store, something caught my eye. There was an ice cream carton lying on the floor, right in front of the freezer doors. It was still sealed, perfectly intact, but just sitting there like someone had dropped it. I frowned. No one had been in this section recently. The few customers I'd had earlier didn't even go near the freezers. I bent down to pick it up, telling myself it was nothing. I stood up with the carton in hand, and as I reached out to open the freezer door, something cold and solid wrapped around my wrist. The sensation was all too real, yet there was nothing visible holding me. I yanked my hand back, pulling it toward my chest as I stumbled backward. My eyes darted around the freezer aisle. There was no one here. But I had felt it. Something had grabbed me. Panic surged through me, cold and sharp. I stared at my hand, my skin tingling where the grip had been. Then red marks, tracing the outline of where those fingers had been. They were narrow, and there were only 3 distinct markings, like the hand that had grabbed me had only 3 fingers. What the hell? I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded small, almost drowned out by the eerie situation. I rushed back, my hand still tingling from the icy touch. The thin, red lines on my wrist were still there, burning slightly, as if whatever had touched me had left a mark deeper than just on the surface. When I reached the counter, I leaned against it, breathing heavily, my heart still racing in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of the cold, thin fingers gripping my wrist. I was still staring at my hand when something shifted in the corner of my vision. My head snapped up, eyes darting toward the back of the store, and that's when I saw it again. The figure, just like before, standing between the aisles in the poorly lit section. Its form was obscured by shadows, but I knew it was the same figure from earlier. That unsettling presence I had seen but convinced myself wasn't real. It was standing there, staring at me, unmoving. This time I felt the panic creeping up faster. Rule number 1. Always nod or wave to acknowledge its presence, and it will leave you alone. Was this really happening? I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat making it difficult to breathe. I lifted my arm slowly and gave a small, hesitant wave toward the shadowy figure at the end of the aisle. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward or shift in any way. But then, its face, or what passed for a face, lit up with an unnerving, wide grin. The smile was impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, teeth gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. It wasn't a smile of joy or warmth, it was too sharp, too predatory. It radiated a faint, unnatural glow, like the smile itself was made of something otherworldly. And then, the figure vanished. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't my imagination. Something was happening, something far worse than I had been prepared for. "Oh my God," I whispered, my heart pounding harder than ever. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt weak, my mind racing. With trembling hands, I opened the drawer again, the faint creak of the wood making my heart jump. I fumbled inside, feeling the familiar rough texture of the folded paper. The list of rules. I had to double-check it, make sure I hadn't missed anything crucial. My mind was spinning after what had just happened, but I needed something concrete to hold on to, even if it was just a set of bizarre, unsettling rules. As I unfolded the paper, the front door chimed. I flinched, my nerves still on edge, but it was only a customer, a middle-aged man. He looked normal enough. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. "It's fine, just another customer," I thought, trying to force my heart rate back to normal. He nodded to me briefly and walked further into the store. I watched him for a second, then turned my attention back to the list, clinging to it like a lifeline. "Okay," I muttered under my breath, scanning the rules. "Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. count the customers. No more than 5. I glanced at the clock on the wall, just past 1 a.m. So far, only this middle-aged guy had come in. Customer number 1. I had to keep track. No room for mistakes. And at 2:45 a.m. clean aisle 3. I sighed. It seemed simple enough in theory, but after what had already happened tonight, nothing felt simple anymore. Still, the market wasn't large. I could handle counting a few customers and cleaning 1 aisle. I repeated the steps to myself, like a mantra, trying to find comfort in the routine. Another customer walked in as the middle-aged man finished checking out, wishing me a good night as he took his bag and left. I watched him walk through the automatic doors and disappear into the night. That's 2, I thought. I mentally added the new arrival to the count. Then the woman who entered next didn't glance at me. She didn't say a word. She walked straight ahead, her eyes locked in a distant, unblinking stare. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, like she was being controlled. Her skin pale and almost unnaturally smooth, shimmered under the store's fluorescent lights as if it wasn't skin at all but something else, something artificial. I watched her as she disappeared into one of the aisles, breaking the line of sight. My breath caught in my throat. It took everything in me not to follow her, to see if she was real or something else entirely. But I shook my head, forcing myself to stay behind the counter. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, trying to sound convincing. "Just a weird customer." I glanced at the clock again. It was just past 2 a.m. Aisle 7 was the next danger zone. According to the rules, I'd have to avoid it for the rest of the night, and that felt like the simplest thing in the world compared to what I'd already encountered. I checked the security monitor, peeking at the dim view of aisle 7. Everything seemed normal. At around 2:30 a.m., the door chimed again. I turned to see another customer enter. A man, this one seemingly normal. He wandered through the aisles, picking up a few items. I breathed a small sigh of relief, grateful that he seemed ordinary. But something nagged at me. The third customer, the woman with the robotic movements, I hadn't seen her leave. My eyes flicked back to the monitor, and I switched through the different camera angles. Nothing. No sign of her anywhere in the store. Maybe she left and I didn't notice, I thought, trying to convince myself. But the pit of unease in my stomach only grew deeper. 4 customers now. I mentally ticked them off, hoping and praying that no more would come before 4 a.m. The idea of encountering a 6th customer was something I couldn't even bear to think about. I watched the newest customer as he checked out with his goods, offering a polite goodnight as he walked out. 4, I reminded myself. The minutes ticked by slowly, dragging like hours, and then my attention snapped to the clock. It was almost 2:45 a.m. Time to clean aisle 3, I thought, dread settling in my gut like a stone. I grabbed a mop and bucket from the back room and slowly made my way to the aisle. My footsteps echoed in the quiet store, the squeak of the wheels on the mop bucket sounding unnervingly loud. But just as I reached the aisle, I heard something. A whisper, faint and distant. I froze, gripping the handle of the mop. The sound seemed to drift through the air, faint but unmistakable. It was calling my name. I turned slowly, the whisper growing clearer, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat hammering in my ears. The sound was coming from the other side of the store, near aisle 7. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the sound, each step reluctant, but something compelled me forward. The whisper grew louder the closer I got, my name over and over again like a distant plea. I reached the edge of aisle 7, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew. But something took over, some dark curiosity that made me peek around the corner. And what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The aisle wasn't normal anymore. Mannequins stood scattered throughout, posed as if shopping, their stiff limbs dressed in tattered clothing. Their plastic faces were blank, yet they radiated a silent menace that I couldn't explain. It was as if they'd been caught mid-action, and the second I looked, they frozen in place. I pulled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I took a breath and peeked again, against every instinct telling me not to. This time, all the mannequins were looking directly at me. I staggered back, my hands shaking, my pulse roaring in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed planted to the spot, frozen in terror. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, and then at the far end of the aisle, I spotted her. Customer number 3. The woman with the robotic movements. She stood at the end of the aisle, staring directly at me, her face blank. My heart dropped into my stomach. She was there. Suddenly she moved. No, she burst toward me, her body jerking unnaturally, her limbs flailing in that same mechanical rhythm. I let out a strangled cry and bolted, sprinting as fast as I could away from aisle 7. I could hear the heavy thud of her footsteps growing louder, faster. As the sound of footsteps reached the edge of the aisle, they stopped. I whipped around and there was nothing. No sign of her, no sound. I ran back to the counter, gasping for air. My hands flew to the security monitor, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the cameras. Aisle 7 appeared normal on the feed, no mannequins, no woman, just an empty, quiet aisle. And then, from somewhere deep in the store, I heard my name again. This time I wasn't playing this game anymore. I glanced at the clock. It was past 2:45 a.m. aisle 3. I need to clean aisle 3. I grabbed the mop and bucket, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I bolted toward aisle 3, dread pooling in my stomach. As I approached, my heart sank further. There was a pool of something on the floor. A thick, dark liquid spread across the tiles, glistening under the store's fluorescent lights. Worse, I could see wet footprints leading away from the puddle, small and childlike, heading toward the far end of the aisle. I didn't have time to think. I just moved. I rushed toward the spill, plunging the mop into the murky liquid and furiously scrubbing the floor. My hands shook as I worked, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What is this? I thought, panic clawing at my mind. What is leaving these footprints? I mopped and scrubbed, my heart pounding in my ears. The footprints led toward the end of the aisle, but as I got closer, they stopped just around the corner, vanished as if whoever or whatever had left them had simply disappeared. I stared down at the now clean floor, my hands trembling around the handle of the mop. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I didn't know what was real. I left the mop and bucket behind and stumbled back to the counter, feeling completely drained, physically and mentally. Exhausted, terrified. My chest heaved as I leaned against the counter, gasping for breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. I thought about Jackson again, how exhausted and terrified he had been when he warned me. He must have gone through all of this, experienced every one of these horrifying things to make that list of rules. A part of me wondered how he had survived it. Another part of me wasn't sure he had. It was nearing 4 a.m. and I was almost done with Rule 3, counting customers. Or at least I thought I was. Somewhere along the way, amidst the strange events, I had lost track. My mind had been all over the place, jumping from one unsettling moment to another. The panic of the night had scrambled my focus. I tried to piece it back together, but the harder I thought, the more I realized I wasn't sure how many customers had actually come in. Then, the entrance door chimed, its sharp sound jolting me out of my thoughts. My head snapped toward the door, and in walked a lone customer. He were bundled up in a thick winter coat, the hood pulled low over their face, which was strange. Something about him immediately set me on edge. The way he moved, slow, aimless, like he had no real purpose in the store. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge me. He just wandered, drifting between the aisles, never picking anything up. I watched him carefully, my nerves taut, trying to figure out if this was the 5th customer or something else. The rule replayed in my mind, after the 5th customer, any others are not human. If a 6th enters, lock yourself in the back office. My heart pounded in my chest. Was this the 5th customer? The night had become a blur of fear and confusion, and now I couldn't remember what was real anymore. As I stared at the man, something odd caught my eye, his reflection in the store's large front windows. It wasn't right. The image flickered, glitching in and out like a broken video feed. The movements looked distorted, out of sync with their actual body. My stomach twisted with dread. Suddenly, the man stopped dead in their tracks, standing perfectly still. Slowly, he turned to face me, and I could feel the weight of their gaze through the shadows of the hood. 2 pale, ghostly eyes stared out from the darkness, locking onto me. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. And it felt like they were looking straight into my soul, seeing something in me that no one should ever see. Panic hit me like a freight train. I bolted from the counter, my legs moving on pure instinct. I didn't care what he was. I just knew I needed to get away. My heart thundered in my chest as I ran toward the back office, my footsteps echoing through the empty store. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the customer far behind me, but he was much closer than he should have been, gliding across the floor without moving his legs, almost like a statue being dragged, his eyes still fixed on me, unblinking. I pushed myself harder, sprinting through the aisles until I reached the back office. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Silence enveloped me like a suffocating blanket, just the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, a low-pitched hum began to vibrate through the walls. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, resonating from behind the door like some kind of electrical charge building in the air. I gulped, pressing my ear to the door, trying to make sense of it. My body was frozen with fear, my breath shallow and quiet, not daring to make a sound. The hum persisted for what felt like an eternity, filling the air with an ominous tension. And then, it faded away. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, like the store itself was holding its breath. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, my back pressed against the door, waiting for something to happen. But the only thing that greeted me was the eerie, suffocating stillness of the night. Eventually, the fear began to dull and curiosity took over. I hadn't heard anything for a while. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling as I turned it. I cracked the door open, peeking out into the store.
Everything seemed normal.
The aisles were empty, the lights buzzing faintly overhead. There was no sign of the customer, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but I knew better than to trust appearances now. Nothing felt right. I made my way back to the counter. the tension of the night still buzzing beneath my skin. But there was a slight sense of relief beginning to creep in. I glanced at the monitor once more, scanning the empty aisles. The store was deserted, just as it should be. One more hour, one last stretch, and I'd be free of this nightmare for good. I kept watching the clock, the minutes ticking away slowly. It was almost over, just a little longer, and I'd be walking out of here, never to return to the night shift again. With each passing second, the weight on my shoulders lifted slightly. It was almost 6 a.m. No customers had come in during the last few hours, or so I thought. The store had been quiet, unnaturally so, but I was grateful for it. The fewer customers, the fewer things that could go wrong. Then, just as I was beginning to feel a flicker of hope, a soft knock echoed from the back door. I froze, my mind racing. I glanced at the clock. It was 5:50 a.m., 10 minutes until I could leave. I hesitated. The knock came again, firmer this time. Reluctantly, I walked toward the back door, each step slow and cautious. I unlocked it and opened it carefully. Standing there, smiling, was one of my colleagues from the day shift. "Hey," he said casually, "how was the night? You look like you've seen something." I stared at him, feeling a pit of dread growing in my stomach. "Yeah," I muttered, my voice hollow. "You could say that."
He proceeded towards the counter.
As he stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sense of impending doom weighed on me, and my heart began to race again. I glanced around the dimly lit store, my nerves on edge. Suddenly the lights flickered, and then, without warning, everything went dark. The store was plunged into pitch blackness, and my breath caught in my throat. It was still dark outside, far too early for daylight, and now the store felt completely cut off from the world. My pulse quickened as I realized the power had gone out. I grabbed a flashlight from the back office, flicking it on in the suffocating darkness. I bolted toward the counter to check on my colleague, but when I got there, he was gone. I scanned the aisles with the flashlight, but there was no sign of him. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran to the door, my flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge.
I turned, shining the flashlight through the glass. What I saw made my blood run cold. The world outside wasn't just dark, it was void. An abyss. The light from my flashlight didn't penetrate it at all. It was as if the darkness was swallowing the light whole, consuming everything beyond the threshold of the store. I couldn't see anything, no buildings, no streetlights, nothing.
The clock on the wall caught my eye, and my stomach dropped. It was 6:02 a.m. Jackson told me to leave at 6 a.m. sharp, not earlier, not later. I felt panic rising in my throat as the realization hit me. I had made a terrible mistake.
I began running around the store, desperate, trying to figure out what to do. I had no plan, no idea what was happening, but I needed to escape. The store felt different now, like the walls were closing in. The aisles seemed to stretch and warp, twisting in ways that defied logic. Voices echoed through the space, whispers, groans, distant sobs. I could hear the mannequin woman from earlier, her stiff, robotic movements shuffling through the aisles. Somewhere behind me, the man in the winter coat moved soundlessly, his hollow eyes still searching.
I didn't know what was real anymore, or how long I'd been running. The store was changing, shifting, the aisles no longer obeying the rules of space and time. My breath came in short, panic gasps as the voices grew louder, the walls seeming to pulse around me. I turned a corner, only to find myself back where I started. No matter which direction I ran, it all looped endlessly. Time was slipping away too. My mind struggled to hold on to moments, to figure out if seconds or hours were passing. I screamed, though I didn't know if any sound came out. Everything blurred together as my movements became frantic. My body felt weightless, as if I was floating through the chaos, trapped in an endless loop of repeating aisles and shifting shadows. Suddenly, I found myself back at the rear of the store, standing just by the back door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. I shoved it open, bursting out into the cool night air. The world outside was still dark, but now it was the familiar darkness of early night, not the void I had seen earlier. I glanced at my watch, my heart pounding in my ears. It was 11 p.m. With shaking hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pen and the list of rules. My hand trembled as I scribbled down the last entry. Rule 8, whatever you do, leave the supermarket at 6 a.m. sharp, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. If you don't, the store will feel different, like it's been sealed away from the world. The aisles will shift and stretch, and strange entities will roam through the store. You'll be trapped with them until night falls again. I stared at the note, my heart sinking as I realized just how real these rules were. I glanced down at my hand, the same hand that had felt the icy grip earlier, and the 3-fingered markings were still faintly visible on my skin. This was real, every part of it. As I stood there, one of my colleagues approached the back of the store, waving at me casually.
"Hey, everyone's been looking for you," he said, as if nothing was wrong. "You all right?"
I didn't respond. I didn't know how to explain what had happened. "I'm taking the night shift tonight," he added. "Is there anything I should know?" I swallowed hard, pulling out the list of rules and handed it to him. "This is not a joke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Read them. Follow them. Exactly." He looked at me, confused, but I didn't wait for a response. I just turned and walked away, my footsteps heavy with the weight of what I had experienced. I knew I couldn't explain it to him, couldn't convince him of what was coming. I left the supermarket behind, knowing I would never return, not during the day, and certainly not during the night. Never again. Story number 1. Just as I thought those things scuttered off elsewhere, they came crawling right back and let their presence be known to me. I think they knew I'm inside. I fear that stepping out that door would surge a sharp feeling of dread, so much so I may struggle to breath, for my head hurts, and I felt like this since their horrid singing started echoing through the trees again. You're lucky to even be reading such right now. If it weren't for my immediate family expressing that they believe me, that I am not a madman, I dare not share this story on the internet in fear no soul would listen. It was a cold day in January, but it was set to be a good day, for it was my last in the workplace, and I was set to fly up to Vancouver later that night. Most of my relatives lived near the city, and they wanted to throw a celebration. Who would I be not to accept? And so the day prior, I had already made all the preparations for the trip. The struggle that day was on the drive home. I felt tired, and the monotonous task of sitting in traffic stole most of my time. The sun started to set, and the sky shone a deep red. I flicked on my vehicle's headlights. The highway was packed due to a pileup ahead. The crashes were awful, and 7 of the 8 vehicles seemed damaged beyond repair. White tarps covered a large chunk of the road, and red was splattered upon one of the windshields. It wasn't a very welcoming scene, to say the least. It's the worst crash I've ever seen in person. I was just ecstatic to finally move past. The moon shone bright behind the towering trees. I live in a really wooded area, so at some point during the drive, everything became quiet and tranquil. I was on the last stretch of road before reaching my street, and nothing but darkness flooded the view ahead. I closed my eyes, and for a second, swerved into the other lane. A curdling screech echoed into the forest, and marks stained the concrete. I lost complete control of the vehicle. Coming towards the top of my street, my car wrapped around a tree. I was bleeding a bit, and smoke rose from beneath the car's hood. It was quiet, and an awful pain surged through my right hand. For a second, I assumed it to be broken, as when I woke, all was cold, and I couldn't feel a thing. Even the forest emanated a terrible, eerie stiffness. The grotesque silhouettes of trees watched as I slithered out the passenger side window. Such was hardly noticeable under the moonlight, yet in that moment I noticed the scent of gasoline, the bumps in the concrete, the faint sparkles of melting snow, the individual shards of glass, and the flakes of steel upon the ground. I couldn't fathom how intricate the world was at that moment. I started pacing towards my house as it was just down the street. A weight felt to be holding me down. I passed one house, then a section of thick woods, then another house. As I dragged myself along, I reached into my pockets and found my phone, to which I would then call the police. "What's your emergency?" I crashed my car atop my street, Blake Avenue. Thank God I'm not too hurt. I'm walking back home right now. "It's not blocking the road, is it? And you're able to walk home?" "It's crashed into a tree," I replied. "It shouldn't be blocking anything. And yes, I should make it back home." "Okay, where do you live?" "Somebody's on their way over now." "Blake Avenue." "It's the last house on the street." Before the